Peter, the Chief Justice, and his twin brother Paul, a top cybercrime detective, are unknowingly hunting their own father, Emeka, a notorious Yahoo boy with a dark past. Their mother, Chiamaka, grows uneasy whenever the case is mentioned, her strange reactions sparking suspicion. Paul senses she is hiding something, but neither brother imagines the truth, that the fraudster they are after is their own blood. Chiamaka silently battles with the weight of this secret, revealing it could shatter everything. Meanwhile, Emeka is running out of time. The law is closing in, and his past sins are finally catching up with him. The truth is inevitable, and when it comes, it will change everything. Emeka had always prided himself on being one step ahead. He wasn't just another fraudster. He was the fraudster, the one everyone feared, the one who made millions disappear with the click of a button. When people whispered about Yahoo boys, his name was mentioned with both admiration and fear. He had mastered the art of cyber fraud, bending people's will to his advantage. He wasn't satisfied with simple romance scams or email phishing. No, Emeka had elevated the game. He had tapped into something darker, something that made sure his victims obeyed without question. But now, all that was gone. Sitting in a rundown hotel room with flickering light bulbs and a creaky ceiling fan, he stared at the pile of empty beer bottles on the floor. His once well-groomed dreadlocks were now unkempt, and his designer polo shirt was stained with sweat. This was not the life he had envisioned for himself. His phone vibrated on the table. Another alert. He hesitated before checking it, his fingers shaking slightly. The moment he saw the message, his stomach twisted. Interpol has issued an international arrest warrant for Emeka Okafor, notorious cybercriminal wanted for multiple online scams across different countries. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just EFCC. This was bigger. The walls were closing in. He could feel it. He had been on the run for weeks, switching hotels, changing SIM cards, avoiding cameras. But no matter how careful he was, they always seemed to be one step behind. Something wasn't right. Someone was tracking him. What Emeka didn't know, what he couldn't even begin to suspect, was that the detectives leading the hunt for him were his own flesh and blood. His phone rang again. This time, it wasn't an alert. It was Baba. He stared at the screen, dread creeping into his chest. Baba never called unless it was serious. With a deep breath, he picked up. "Your time is ticking, Emeka." Baba's voice rasped through the phone. Emeka clenched his jaw. "Baba, I already told you I'm handling it." "No, you are not." The line went silent for a few seconds before Baba spoke again, his voice lower, more ominous. "Find Chiamaka and appeal to her, or you will die soon." Emeka shut his eyes, rubbing his temple. "You think I don't know that?" His voice was laced with frustration. "I've been trying, but I don't even know where she is." Baba's laugh was dry and humorless. "Then find her before they do, because the spirits you betrayed, they are already with you." The call ended. A sharp chill ran down Emeka's spine. He turned his head slightly, glancing at the dark corners of the room. The feeling of being watched had become unbearable. The shadows didn't move, but they felt alive. He had been waking up in cold sweats, hearing whispers in the dead of night, feeling unseen hands brush against his skin. He had dismissed it at first, thinking it was just paranoia. But deep down, he knew better. His mind drifted back to the night it all began, the night he should have completed the ritual. The memory played out vividly, as if it had happened just yesterday. The air had been thick with the scent of burning incense. The dimly lit shrine was filled with chants, echoing through the enclosed space. The red cloth tied around his waist felt heavy, like it was dragging him down. Chiamaka lay on the ritual mat, bound and trembling, her eyes swollen from crying. She had pleaded, begged him to stop. "Emeka, please. I love you. Don't do this." Her voice had cracked, breaking something inside him. For a brief moment he had hesitated, the knife trembling in his hand. That moment of hesitation had cost him everything. The ritual had failed. Chiamaka had escaped. Baba had been furious. And from that night on, his downfall had begun. At first, the signs were subtle. Small glitches in his scams, payments that didn't go through, investors pulling out at the last minute. But then, things got worse. He started losing money. Accounts got frozen. Friends disappeared. The luck that had once shielded him was gone. And then came the nightmares. He would wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, his chest tight as if an invisible force was pressing down on him. He would hear Chiamaka's screams echoing in his head, her voice blending with eerie whispers that grew louder each night. At first, he thought it was just guilt, but then the real hauntings began. He would see shadows move in broad daylight. Objects would shift when he wasn't looking. The worst part was the feeling, the unbearable sensation that he was never alone. And now, with Baba's warning, he knew there was no escaping it. He had to find Chiamaka. The problem was, she had disappeared from his life completely. He had no idea where to start looking. The law was hunting him. The spirits were hunting him. And the woman he needed to find the most probably wanted him dead. He ran a shaky hand through his hair. For the first time in his life, Emeka felt something he had never truly felt before. Fear. Peter and Paul sat across from each other in a quiet cafe, stirring their cups of coffee absent-mindedly. The low hum of conversations around them blended with the soft clinking of spoons against ceramic, but their minds were far from the warmth of their drinks. There was something unsettling in the air, a feeling neither of them could shake. Peter leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, eyes narrowed in deep thought. "Paul, have you noticed how Mama acts strange whenever we bring up Emeka's case?" Paul, who had been staring at his untouched coffee, looked up. "I thought it was just me," he admitted. "At first, I assumed she was just concerned, you know, the way any mother would be if her sons were handling a dangerous case. But now? I don't know, Peter. Something feels off." Peter tapped his fingers against the table. "It's not just concern. It's something else. Every time we mention Emeka's name, she either changes the subject or finds an excuse to leave the room." Paul exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Exactly. And did you see how she reacted last night? We were watching the news when his name came up, and the way she grabbed the remote and switched the channel so fast." Peter nodded, his expression darkening, like she couldn't bear to hear it. There was a brief silence between them. The truth hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. Their mother was hiding something. Paul finally broke the silence, lowering his voice. "Peter, do you think she knows something about Emeka?" Peter looked around cautiously before leaning in. "I don't just think. I'm sure of it. And it's not just knowing him. I feel like she has a connection to this case that we don't understand yet." Paul swallowed. The thought was disturbing, but he couldn't ignore the growing suspicion in his gut. "But how? And why wouldn't she tell us?" Peter let out a slow breath. "That's what we need to find out." The cafe's door swung open, letting in a brief gust of wind. The noise of the outside world felt distant compared to the intensity of their conversation. Paul rubbed his temples. "You know what's worse? We're leading this investigation, and yet we might be missing the biggest piece of the puzzle." Peter sat up straighter, his expression now resolute. "Which is why we have to be careful. We can't just move forward blindly." He lowered his voice even further. "Paul, we have to suspend this case for now and dig deeper into this man before making it public." Paul's eyebrows furrowed as he considered Peter's words. He wasn't one to pause an investigation, especially not one this big. But the weight of their mother's reactions, the unease that clung to this case, it didn't feel like a normal assignment anymore. He finally nodded. "You're right. There's more to this than we're seeing, and if Mama is connected to Emeka in any way, we need to know before we expose anything." Peter relaxed slightly but kept his serious tone. "We dig in quietly. We start from scratch. Everything we thought we knew about Emeka, we question it. Every lead, every document, we go over them again. We look beyond just cyber fraud. This is bigger than that, Paul sighed. And Mama? Peter hesitated before answering. For now, we watch. We don't confront her yet. Not until we have something solid, Paul exhaled heavily, nodding. Agreed. The waiter came by to refill their coffee, but neither of them touched their cups. The case they were handling had just taken a personal, unexpected turn, and they both had a feeling that whatever truth was waiting for them, it wouldn't be easy to accept. Chiamaka sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the dimly lit room. The past few weeks had been a nightmare, one she couldn't wake up from. She had tried to push the thoughts away, tried to ignore the gnawing ache in her chest, but it was impossible. Her sons were unknowingly hunting their own father. How had it come to this? She had spent years burying the past, convincing herself that the life she once lived belonged to another version of her, one she had long since left behind. But now it was crawling back, threatening to tear everything apart. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She had considered calling Emeka, warning him, telling him to run before it was too late. But what would that change? Would he even listen? She let out a shaky breath. Despite everything he had done, despite the betrayal, despite the fact that he had almost sacrificed her, she still felt something for him. It wasn't love, not in the way it once was, but something deeper, something unexplainable. Maybe it was because he was the father of her children. Maybe it was because, at some point before greed consumed him, he had been a good man. She rubbed her forehead, exhausted. Peter and Paul. They had no idea who they were really after. She wanted to protect them from the truth. But how much longer could she hold it in? How much longer before the truth revealed itself in the worst possible way? She had to say something. But how? Her eyes drifted to the old wooden clock on the wall. It was past midnight, yet she knew she wouldn't be able to sleep. Neither would they. She picked up her phone and sent them both a message. Come to my room. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock at her door. Mama, Peter's voice came first. She swallowed hard before answering. Come in. Peter and Paul stepped inside, exchanging confused glances. They could see the worry on her face, the way she sat stiffly, her fingers laced together tightly. Paul frowned. Mama, what's wrong? Chiamaka took a deep breath, her heart pounding. This was it. This was the moment. But she couldn't just say it. Instead, she asked a question that had been haunting her for days. If I were once a prostitute, would you forgive me? A heavy silence filled the room. Peter and Paul looked at each other, completely thrown off by the question. Paul scratched the back of his head. Mama, why are you asking that? Chiamaka's throat felt tight. Just answer me. Peter, always the calmer one, spoke first. His voice was steady, but there was uncertainty behind it. You are our mother. Nothing will ever change that. Paul nodded, though he still looked confused. Yeah, Mama. Whatever it is you're trying to say, it doesn't change the fact that we love you. Chiamaka's heart pounded violently in her chest. They had no idea. She gripped the sheets beneath her, trying to steady herself. Should she tell them now? Should she rip off the bandage and reveal everything? Her lips parted, but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, she found herself whispering something else. Think twice before it's too late. Peter's brows furrowed. Mama, what are you trying to say? Chiamaka looked at both of them, her eyes glistening. She wanted to tell them. She needed to tell them. But the words caught in her throat. She shook her head. Just promise me. Whatever happens, you'll think twice. Paul exhaled, frustrated. Mama, you're scaring us. What's going on? She forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. Nothing, my sons. Just be careful. The two young men exchanged one last glance before nodding. Okay, Mama, Peter said softly. We'll think twice. But Chiamaka knew the truth was already on its way. Emeka sat alone in a dimly lit hotel room, his back against the cold wall. His once proud shoulders were slumped, his gold chains discarded on the bedside table, his expensive designer shirt wrinkled from days of being worn. His phone lay face down beside him, its screen cracked from the last time he had hurled it in frustration. The walls seemed to close in on him. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. His empire had crumbled overnight. His bank accounts were frozen. The law was closing in. The spirits of the ones he had wronged haunted his every waking moment. There was no escape. He picked up the pistol he had stolen from one of his guys, his hands shaking as he weighed it in his palm. Maybe this was the only way out. His breathing was ragged, his chest burned. The whispers in his head grew louder. End it. It's over. There's nothing left. Tears stung his eyes. He never thought it would end like this. With trembling hands, he raised the gun to his temple, his finger hovering over the trigger. His entire life flashed before him, his childhood, his rise to wealth, his betrayals, the night he almost sacrificed Chiamaka. And then, a different voice, software yet powerful. I know I deserve hell, but please forgive me. The words slipped from his lips before he could stop them. His body shook with sobs as the gun fell from his grip, clattering to the floor. He buried his face in his hands, his entire body trembling. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, above consequences. But now, he was just a broken man begging for mercy. Something in his chest stirred. He couldn't explain it, but an urge, a pull, tugged at him. His legs felt weak as he forced himself up. He didn't know where he was going. His mind screamed for him to stay, but something stronger pushed him forward. Before he knew it, he was in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel. The streets blurred past him, neon lights flashing in the distance, and then he saw it. A church. His pulse quickened, his throat tightened. His fingers clenched the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He hadn't stepped inside a church in years. What was he doing here? His heart pounded as he parked the car, but his legs moved on their own. One step, another. A force greater than himself carried him inside. The church was mostly empty. A few people knelt in prayer, lost in their own worlds. At the front, an elderly pastor sat, his head bowed. Emeka hesitated. His palms were sweaty. He didn't belong here, and yet, his feet carried him forward. The pastor looked up, his wise eyes meeting Emeka's desperate ones. I need to confess, Emeka croaked. His throat felt dry as if he hadn't spoken in days. The pastor studied him, his gaze gentle but knowing. Sit down, son. Emeka sat heavily on the pew, elbows on his knees, head hanging low. And then he let it all out. He told the pastor everything, the fraud, the rituals, the blood, the sacrifices, the pain. Chiamaka. Her face haunted him the most. The fear in her eyes that night. By the time he finished, his body was shaking. He had never spoken of his sins before. He had buried them deep, locked them away. But now, under the weight of his own confession, he felt raw, exposed. The pastor was silent for a long time, his gaze steady. Then, finally, he spoke. No one has the right to predict your death. His voice was calm, filled with certainty. If you are truly sorry, God will forgive you. Emeka's breath hitched. Forgiveness? Could such a thing even exist for him? The pastor leaned forward. God's mercy is greater than any sin, but you must repent. Do you truly regret what you have done? Tears slipped down Emeka's cheeks. His head bobbed in a desperate nod. I do. I swear. I do. The pastor placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Then let's pray. As the pastor's words filled the air, something inside Emeka cracked open. It was unlike anything he had ever felt before. Not magic. Not a ritual. Grace. It was overwhelming, washing over him like waves crashing against the shore. He didn't understand it, but for the first time in his life, he didn't feel completely alone. When the prayer ended, the pastor met his gaze again. You need to turn yourself in. Emeka's stomach dropped. "What?" The pastor didn't waver. "A miracle will happen in your darkest moment, but you must take the first step." Emeka's throat went dry. Turn himself in, face the consequences, the law. But deep down, he knew the pastor was right. He had spent his life running. Maybe it was time to stop. Emeka sat in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the mess of papers and old documents scattered across the floor. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up a worn-out folder, flipping through its contents without really seeing them. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. He had barely slept since walking out of the church. Turn yourself in. A miracle will happen in your darkest moment. The pastor's words still echoed in his head. He wanted to believe them, but reality had never been that kind to him. He was a wanted man. His name was on every cybercrime watch list. The authorities would never forgive him. Could he ever truly undo the damage he had done? A sigh escaped his lips as he tossed the folder aside. His fingers brushed against an old, dust-covered flash drive buried beneath the papers. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It looked familiar. Where had he seen this before? Frowning, he plugged it into his laptop. The screen flickered, and within seconds a folder popped open. His heart almost stopped when he saw the file names: encrypted keys, password logs, financial records. His pulse quickened. His fingers moved on their own, opening one file after another. Then he saw it, a forgotten key phrase. His stomach clenched, his breathing turned shallow. Number it couldn't be. With shaking hands, he copied the key phrase and accessed an old cryptocurrency wallet he hadn't touched in years. As soon as he entered the phrase, the balance loaded. Billions. His breath caught in his throat. Billions of dollars. Money he had stolen. Money that had disappeared without a trace. Money that had ruined lives. His head spun as he stared at the screen. This was it. The last piece of his past. For a moment, the old Emeka whispered to him, "You can run, start over, disappear." But then, another voice, one that had been growing louder since the church, cut through the noise. "You can do the right thing." He swallowed hard, his hands clammy against the keyboard. Could he? Could he really undo what he had done? He closed his eyes, exhaling shakily. And then, he made his choice. One by one, he traced the victims. Every transaction, every stolen amount, every ruined dream. It took days, long, exhausting nights of searching, verifying and tracking down the people whose lives he had shattered. Some had lost their businesses. Some had lost their homes. Some had even lost their loved ones to the stress of financial ruin. Emeka's chest tightened as he read their stories. He had done this. His fingers trembled as he initiated the transfers. One by one, the stolen billions disappeared from his account, returning to their rightful owners. The weight on his chest grew heavier, but for the first time, it wasn't guilt. It was something else. Relief. The news spread like wildfire. First, small online forums buzzed with confusion. Then, victims started posting screenshots, money appearing in their accounts with no explanation. Then the media caught on. Unbelievable cyber reversal. Victims of online fraud receive stolen billions back. Anonymous cybercriminal returns, stolen fortune. Authorities stunned. The headlines flooded every news outlet. Social media exploded. People speculated. Governments scrambled. Who was doing this? The authorities were baffled. This had never happened before. Cybercriminals didn't return money. They vanished. And yet, here it was. A miracle in their darkest moment. Paul was in his office, eyes glued to his computer screen, reviewing some case files when his phone rang. His brows furrowed as he saw the caller ID, HQ Cybercrime Unit. A call from them at this hour? Something was off. He picked up. "Agent Paul speaking." A familiar voice responded, but there was an unusual calmness to it. Too calm. "Paul, the case is closed." Paul straightened in his chair. "Closed?" He blinked, momentarily confused. "What do you mean, closed? We're actively tracking this guy. We were close to getting him." "It's over," the voice on the other end sighed. "Listen, you won't believe this, but every single victim from the fraud case has received their money back." Paul's mouth went dry. "What?" "The exact amount defrauded," the voice continued, "has been reversed to each victim by the same fraudster." Paul could feel his heartbeat in his ears. His fingers gripped the phone tighter. "That's impossible," he muttered. "No cyber criminal does that. Why would he?" "We don't know," the voice admitted. "But from our end, this case is done. We've verified the transactions. Every single cent has been returned. No one is pressing charges anymore. As far as the agency is concerned, we're moving on." Paul leaned back in his chair, running a hand down his face. He had spent months chasing this man, going through files, tracking transactions, piecing together leads. And now it was all over, just like that. He shook his head. This didn't make sense. A fraudster didn't return money. A criminal didn't just wake up one morning and undo everything they had done. So why? Why would someone like Emeka, a man who had been drowning in fraud, wealth, and crime, suddenly decide to give it all back? His thoughts raced as he stared at the case files on his desk. This was supposed to be his biggest bust, but now it felt like the ground had been pulled from under him. Somewhere in his gut, he knew there was more to this than what the agency was seeing. Meanwhile, across town, Emeka was making a decision that would change everything. The night air was heavy as he locked up his house, each turn of the key feeling like the closing of a chapter. He had sold off his possessions, cleared his accounts, and settled any outstanding debts. Even his gatekeeper, who had worked for him for years, had been paid off. "You're leaving, sir?" the man asked hesitantly, staring at the envelope Emeka had handed him. Emeka simply nodded. "Go home. Take care of your family." The man hesitated for a moment, then nodded in return. "Thank you, sir." Emeka said nothing more. He simply turned and walked away. The city was alive as always, cars honking, vendors calling out, streetlights flickering. But to Emeka, it all felt distant, like he was walking through a dream. His feet carried him down familiar streets, past places where he had once flaunted his wealth, past the clubs where he had been treated like a king, past the spots where his name alone could get him anything he wanted. But now he was just a man with nothing but a guilty conscience. He could have run. He could have disappeared. But the words from the pastor still lingered in his heart. Turn yourself in. A miracle will happen in your darkest moment. His hands balled into fists as he finally reached his destination. The police station loomed ahead, its fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow on the pavement. Officers moved in and out of the building, their voices blending into the background. Emeka took a deep breath. This was it. No turning back. He walked up the steps, pushed open the doors, and approached the front desk. A bored-looking officer glanced up from his paperwork. "Can I help you?" Emeka swallowed, his voice steady. "I'm here to surrender myself." The officer frowned. "Surrender? For what?" Emeka exhaled slowly. "For everything." The courtroom was packed. The air felt heavy, charged with tension. Journalists whispered among themselves, cameras flashed, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. This was no ordinary trial. At the center of it all, Emeka stood in the defendant's box, his once proud posture now weighed down by guilt. He had been a man who walked with arrogance, who commanded fear and respect wherever he went, but now he was nothing more than a shadow of himself. The judge's bench loomed above him, and behind it sat Peter. Peter kept his face unreadable, but inside his emotions were a battlefield. When he had been assigned this case, he hadn't expected it to shake him this way. He had spent years chasing cybercriminals, men who ruined lives with the stroke of a keyboard. But there was something about this one, something he couldn't explain. Still, he couldn't afford to let his emotions cloud his judgment. Justice had to be served. The courtroom fell silent as the bailiff announced, "Proceedings are now in session." Emeka stepped forward, his voice steady but laced with pain. "My name is Emeka," he began, and I stand before you as a man guilty of many crimes." A hush fell over the room. The gallery leaned in, waiting for his confession. I was once known as the Yahoo Plus Upmaster, a name that carried power, money, and blood. He took a breath, looking directly at Peter. I deceived people, scammed them out of their life savings, and lived a life of luxury at their expense. Peter clenched his jaw but said nothing. Emeka continued, "But it wasn't just fraud. My hands are stained with sins far worse." His voice dropped. "I almost sacrificed a girl for rituals." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Some gasped, others whispered among themselves. Peter felt his grip tighten on the gavel. This man disgusted him. "I bribed my way out of my first prison sentence," Emeka admitted. "I walked free while innocent people suffered. And when I finally found redemption, I returned every stolen dime. But I know that does not erase my past. I still must pay." The room was eerily silent. This was no ordinary criminal. Criminals denied their sins, fought their charges, begged for lesser sentences. Peter exhaled. He had to push aside the strange feeling in his gut. The law was the law. After a long pause, he spoke. "You have admitted to your crimes, and the court acknowledges your efforts at restitution. However, your past actions caused irreparable damage to countless lives." Peter lifted the gavel. "This court sentences you to—" The courtroom doors burst open. All heads turned as a woman's scream echoed through the chamber. "Stop! Stop this now!" Chiamaka stormed in, her eyes wild with emotion. Paul, seated among the prosecution, suddenly stiffened. "Mom?" A wave of confusion swept through the courtroom. Chiamaka pushed past security, her voice trembling. "I can't stay silent anymore." Her eyes locked onto Emeka, and for a brief second, there was something unreadable in them. Then, she turned to Peter and Paul, who were both looking at her in shock. The words that came next shattered everything. "Emeka is your father." The silence was deafening. Peter blinked, convinced he had misheard her. "What?" Chiamaka swallowed, her voice hoarse. "The girl he tried to sacrifice was me." Paul shot up from his seat, his entire body rigid. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Chiamaka's hands trembled, but she forced herself to speak. "Over 20 years ago, I loved a man. He was charming, powerful, and he made me believe in a future I never had before. But he was also dangerous. I was young and naive." Her gaze darkened. "And then, one night, he tried to offer me as a ritual sacrifice." A gasp rippled through the room. Peter's heart pounded in his chest. He looked at Emeka, who had collapsed to his knees, silent tears streaming down his face. Paul shook his head. "No, this can't be." Chiamaka turned to her sons, her voice barely above a whisper. "I ran that night. I ran, carrying a secret. I was pregnant, with both of you." Everything came crashing down at once. The world tilted. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in. Peter took a step back, his hands shaking. The man he had been hunting, the criminal whose sins disgusted him, the man standing trial before him, was his father. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run. Instead, he stood frozen, his mind racing, the gavel still raised in his hand. Emeka sobbed. For the first time in his life, he had no words. He crawled forward on his knees, his body trembling. "Peter, Paul," his voice cracked. "My sons." Peter's grip on the gavel loosened. "I never knew," Emeka whispered. "I swear to you, I never knew." His body shook with regret. "If I had known, I would have given my life for you." Paul's fists clenched. Too much. This was too much. Emeka turned to Chiamaka. "I have no excuse. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need them to know the truth." He turned back to his sons. "I was a monster. I lived selfishly, hurting people, chasing money and power, but I swear on my life, I never knew you existed." Tears welled in Chiamaka's eyes, but she didn't respond. Peter was breathing heavily. His chest ached. his mind in chaos. This was the man he had despised for so long. This was the man he had vowed to bring to justice. And yet, something inside him was breaking. Paul's voice was hollow. "You tried to kill our mother." "I know," Emeka sobbed harder, "and I will never forgive myself." He turned fully to his sons, his forehead touching the cold courtroom floor. "I beg you, if I die in this prison, let me at least die knowing that you don't hate me." Peter swallowed the lump in his throat. He was trained to be rational, to separate emotion from justice, but right now, he was just a man caught in a storm. Paul exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. The courtroom had forgotten about the trial. All eyes were on the two sons standing before the father they never knew they had. Peter let out a shaky breath. How was he supposed to judge a man who was his own blood? The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that brought peace, but the kind that pressed against the walls, thick with disbelief and unspoken emotions. Peter's fingers trembled around the gavel. His heart pounded so loudly in his chest that he could barely hear anything else. How was this possible? His entire life, he had upheld the law, dedicating himself to justice, never once believing in bending the rules for anyone, not even himself. And now, standing in front of him, kneeling on the cold courtroom floor, was his father, Emeka, the man he had been hunting, the criminal he had built a case against, the father he never knew. Beside him, Paul was shaking his head, his breathing uneven. He looked from their mother to their father, as if hoping someone would wake him from this nightmare. Then, in a voice so broken it barely sounded like his, Paul whispered, "Peter, wait." Peter's grip on the gavel tightened. "Don't hit it," Paul pleaded, stepping closer. "Let's rethink this. Let's talk." Peter squeezed his eyes shut. His whole body was trembling now, his mind drowning in chaos. How do you judge your own father? Emeka was still on his knees, his hands shaking as he stared up at them. His face was drenched in tears. His voice was hoarse. "My sons, I don't deserve your mercy, but if you find it in your hearts, I beg you, don't let your hatred for me ruin you." Peter opened his eyes and met his father's gaze. And for the first time, he didn't see a criminal. He saw a broken man. But was that enough? He had fought for years to take down people like this. Men who had stolen, bribed, and ruined lives. Could he now abandon justice just because this man was his blood? His entire career had been about making sure the law stood firm, that justice was never compromised. Paul was still staring at him, eyes pleading. "Peter, think about it." Peter turned to his mother. Her face was streaked with tears, her hands clutching at her chest. Chiamaka nodded slowly. "I forgave him long ago," she whispered. "Not because he deserved it, but because I needed to be free." Peter swallowed. Was that what freedom looked like? More than anything, he wished he had more time to process this. He wished he could wake up and discover it was all a dream. But the whole courtroom was waiting. The law was waiting. He turned back to Emeka, who was still on his knees. This man had done horrible things. This man had also tried to make things right. Peter sucked in a breath. His hand was shaking. He had to make a choice. His voice was barely a whisper when he said, "I'm sorry." Paul's head snapped up. "Peter!" Peter's eyes glistened with unshed tears, his voice trembling as he uttered the words that would change everything. "The law is blind. Justice must be served." Paul gasped. "Peter, no!" Peter raised the gavel. His breath hitched. Then he let it fall. The sound echoed through the courtroom, heavy and final. Guilty. The sentence, 40 years in prison. For a moment, no one moved. Then the courtroom erupted. Gasps, cries, people whispered, others sobbed openly. Chiamaka collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands, her body shaking as she wept. Paul staggered back as if Peter had physically struck him. His face twisted in disbelief, then rage. How could you? Peter couldn't even look at him. His eyes were locked onto Emeka, who was staring up at him, silent tears trailing down his face. Emeka smiled, and then, in a voice filled with peace, he whispered, "Thank you, my son." Peter's lips parted slightly. He hadn't expected those words. Emeka exhaled, his shoulders relaxing, as though a burden had been lifted. "I deserved this." Peter's chest ached. The weight of his decision pressed against him like an iron fist. He had done what the law required. But why did it feel like he had just sentenced himself? Chiamaka sat in the living room, her face buried in her palms, her body shaking with sobs. The weight of everything, the years of silence, the pain, the lies, the heartbreak was finally too much to bear. She had kept the truth hidden for so long, believing it was for the best. But in the end, had she really protected her sons? Or had she only made things worse? Peter and Paul stood in front of her, their expressions unreadable. She had expected anger, maybe even hatred. She had expected them to walk away from her, disgusted that she had lied to them all their lives. But instead, they knelt before her, wrapping their arms around her. Paul was the first to speak. His voice was gentle but firm. "Mum, it's okay." Chiamaka shook her head violently, tears dripping onto her lap. "No, it's not. I should have told you. I should have—" Peter squeezed her hands. "At least now we know the truth." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "It doesn't change how much we love you." Chiamaka let out a choked sob and pulled them both into a tight embrace. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could finally breathe. Meanwhile, in the cold walls of the prison, Emeka sat in his tiny cell, staring at the ceiling. The past few weeks had been a blur, a storm that had carried him to places he never imagined. From a feared Yahoo Plus fraudster to a fugitive. From a fugitive to a man desperately seeking redemption. From a man seeking redemption to a prisoner. And now he was just waiting. He didn't fight the judgment, he didn't protest the sentence, he knew he had earned it. Still, something inside him ached. Not for freedom, not even for a second chance, but for time. Time with the sons he never got to raise. He sighed and closed his eyes, leaning against the wall. He had made peace with his fate, but fate wasn't done with him yet. That morning, a convoy of black SUVs rolled into the prison yard, their polished exteriors gleaming under the sun. Officers lined up as a tall, distinguished figure stepped out. The president. It was an annual tradition. The president would visit selected prisons, speak with inmates, and grant a few rare pardons. The warden walked beside him, listing names, talking about rehabilitation programs, legal appeals, and inmate behavior. The president nodded as he listened, his eyes scanning the prisoners gathered in the courtyard. Then, his gaze stopped. He narrowed his eyes. He had seen this man before, not in person, but in the news. Emeka. The president turned to the warden. "Who is that man?" The warden hesitated. "Sir, that is Emeka, the man convicted of cyber fraud, and I know who he is." The president's voice was thoughtful. "He's the one who returned the money, isn't he?" "Yes, sir," the warden confirmed. "He surrendered willingly." The president took a step closer, observing Emeka carefully. Emeka, who was now looking up at him, confusion flickering in his tired eyes. Something about this man intrigued the president. A criminal who had everything, power, money, status, but gave it all up and chose to face justice. The president glanced around at his officials, then spoke, his voice clear and firm. "This man, free him." The silence that followed was absolute. The warden blinked. "Sir?" The president's tone didn't waver. "You heard me? Pardon him?" Gasps rippled through the yard. Some prisoners looked on in disbelief, others in envy. Even the officers exchanged surprised glances. Emeka's breath hitched. Did he hear correctly? He felt the world shift beneath his feet, as if reality itself had taken a sharp turn. He searched the president's face, expecting to see mockery, some kind of cruel joke, but there was none. This was real. Tears welled up in his eyes, and for the first time in years, he truly broke. Right there in front of everyone, he sank to his knees, his shoulders shaking with deep guttural sobs. Freedom. A word he never thought he'd taste again. The world, it seemed, was dancing to a new rhythm. His. Emeka stepped out of the prison gates, the sun hitting his face like a forgotten warmth. For years he had imagined this moment, but not like this. He had expected chains, a life sentence, maybe even death. But freedom? It felt unreal. He looked around, unsure of where to go. He had no home, no money, no power, just himself. Then his eyes caught something, a black SUV parked a short distance away. The tinted window rolled down and his heart nearly stopped. Inside, staring right at him, were Chiamaka, Peter, and Paul. They had come. His chest tightened. He took a step forward, but his legs felt weak. He had faced criminals, spirits, even the law, but now, facing his own family was the hardest thing he had ever done. Chiamaka was the first to step out. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment time stretched between them. There was pain, there was anger, but most of all, there was something Emeka never thought he'd see again. Acceptance. Peter and Paul followed, their faces unreadable. They looked at him, looked at the prison behind him, and then back at him. "Dad?" Paul's voice was barely above a whisper. Emeka broke. His knees hit the ground before he even realized it, dust rising around him. His head hung low, his hands clenched. "Let me be the father I should have been," he pleaded, his voice raw with emotion. "I know I don't deserve it, but please, let me try." Chiamaka covered her mouth, her body trembling. This was the man who had once tried to sacrifice her, the man who had left her to raise their children alone, the man who had caused them all so much pain. And yet, here he was. Not the arrogant Yahoo plus master, not the untouchable fraudster, not the criminal on the run, just a broken man. Chiamaka wiped her tears. Her voice was steady but soft. "We came to tell you we forgive you." Emeka's breath hitched. Peter and Paul stood beside her, watching the man they had hunted for so long. They had grown up believing they had no father, believing he was some faceless criminal they would never know. Now that man was here, not demanding anything, not making excuses, just asking for them. Peter, the judge who had sentenced him, swallowed hard. "Despite your past, you are our father," Paul nodded. "Come with us." Emeka lifted his gaze, his vision blurred by tears. And then they moved. All of them, collapsing into each other's arms, crying loudly, crying freely, for the years lost, for the pain endured, for the family they never got to be, and for the hope that somehow they could start again. Deep in the heart of the forest, the night was restless. A heavy storm brewed in the sky, thick clouds swirling like angry spirits. The air smelled of rain and something darker. Inside his dimly lit shrine, Baba sat cross-legged, surrounded by flickering red candles. His face was twisted in frustration. Something was wrong. For years he had held Emeka in his grip, binding him to darkness, ensuring he could never escape. But now everything was unraveling. The spirits had stopped answering, his body felt weaker, and worst of all, he could feel his own death approaching. "No," Baba growled, gripping his staff tightly. "This is not how it ends." But the gods had already decided. A violent gust of wind tore through the shrine, putting out every candle at once. The darkness swallowed him whole. Then, boom! A thunderclap split the sky, and before Baba could react, a bolt of lightning crashed through the roof, striking him dead in an instant. His body convulsed, his mouth wide in a silent scream, and then stillness. The shrine burned to ashes, and with it, every spiritual chain that had bound Emeka. 1 month later, the world felt brand new. Emeka stood at the altar, his heart pounding. The church was filled with people, family, friends. even some who once doubted him. They had all come to witness a miracle, because after everything, the betrayal, the suffering, the loss, he was getting a second chance. Then the doors opened, and there she was, Chiamaka. Dressed in an elegant white gown, her beauty was even more radiant than he remembered. As she walked toward him, every memory flashed before his eyes. The night he almost sacrificed her, the years of separation, the pain he had caused. Yet, here she was, walking to him, choosing him. When she reached him, he whispered, "You forgive me this much?" Chiamaka smiled softly. "I loved you before you lost yourself, and I love you now that you've found your way back." His eyes burned with unshed tears. The priest spoke, but Emeka barely heard a word. All he knew was that for the first time in his life, he was free. When he kissed his bride, the entire church erupted in cheers. The past no longer had power over them. The curse was broken. This was not just a wedding. It was redemption. It was fate. It was a new beginning. The end. Thank you for reading this story of redemption, forgiveness, and fate. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to leave a comment and share your perspective. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more compelling narratives.